Chapter 4. Interrogation. It doesn't make any sense, but there's no possible explanation, Volcara growled, throwing the datapad onto her desk. For all intents and purposes, he is Obi-Wan Kenobi. You can't just alter someone's entire DNA sequence. Qui-Gon Jinn slouched in the chair opposite, looking at his stack of archive holobooks with a deep sense of betrayal. Is it possible they're related by blood? Unlikely. Even if a full half, and that in itself would be a miracle, even if half of his DNA were identical to Obi-Wan's, reconstituting that much of a sentient's DNA is an inadvisable undertaking. Unheard of. He would be brain dead by now. Volcara shrugged. If this man is not Obi-Wan Kenobi, then I don't know who the hell he is. But he's not, Qui-Gon said. That he had to keep repeating this certitude was something akin to madness. Ignoring the fact that my apprentice is currently alive and well, and not under delusions of being dead, this man is at least 20 years older than Obi-Wan. He couldn't fool anyone for more than a glance. I don't think he was trying to fool anyone, Master J snapped, wishing she did not have to consider the tide of ridiculous theories flooding over her logic. Unfortunately, there was no longer any high ground to which to turn. But unless the man is a clone under aging modifications or a force-stamped time traveler, I don't know what else to tell you, Master Jin. They both stayed silent for a moment and sighed in mutual frustration. At length, Qui-Gon ran a hand over his beard and asked hopefully, "He's a strong force-sensitive. Could he have found a way to manipulate the results that way?" Volcara snorted. "He wouldn't be able to think about it, not with the amount of medications I have him under. And yes, before you ask, I reran the tests after I put him under. Speaking of which, it was high time to change the subject." She opened her datapad and brought up a series of flat holos. "I finally got a chance to give him a once-over." "Oh?" "Yes. Aside from a mild dehydration and a few bruises, he's in peak condition." "And yet he believes he's dead," Qui-Gon said with deadpan incredulity. Master Che shrugged. "Some might say he should be." She turned her pad around for Qui-Gon to scroll through the images. The man's a walking pinboard of scars. Some of them should have killed him. Qui-Gon flicked through the series with a tame expression, grimacing once or twice. He paused on one holo and pointed. "Where's this one?" he asked. The scar in question was a long, straight gash. Volcara twisted her head around to look. "Lower left back, below the 7th rib. Looks like blaster damage." Qui-Gon nodded in disturbed silence. Volcara read the expression with a frown. "Obi-Wan?" she asked. He nodded again. She decided it was best to move on. "That's not all. This one is the newest." She flicked through to the end of the series. The image was a shot of the man's neck, bare chest revealing a precise, angry red welt that ran on a slant from left collarbone to right. Silently, Volcara flicked to the next image, showing how the scar appeared from the back. It circumvented his entire neck in one clean, even line. Qui-Gon leaned forward, frowning. The scar tissue was too thick for it to have been superficial. Had it been some sort of surgery? "If you had to make a guess," Volcara quizzed, "what weapon would you say made that mark?" Qui-Gon looked up in surprise. "Weapon?" She nodded. Qui-Gon looked again at the holo, squinting, trying to imagine how anything could inflict such damage. Volcara eventually took his silence as an invitation to offer her thoughts. "One does not work in the temple for as long as I have, without learning what a lightsaber burn looks like." "A lightsaber?" She flicked to a new holo, this time showing the scar from a profile angle. The tissue is mostly healed, but you can see marbling from the original burns. It's too clean to be blaster fire, and nothing but a lightsaber gets hot enough to leave the surrounding skin untouched. She indicated points above the collarbone and at the nape of the neck. They lined up perfectly. "Through and through. A swift and level Sai-Cha." Qui-Gon was so sick of hearing explanations that made no sense. He spent several long seconds fighting the urge to roll his eyes before eventually managing an exasperated, "Decapitation?" Volcara's nod was pointed. It might explain a thing or two about his thoughts on waking up. They shared a long look, both of them wishing they had not been driven to consider this nonsense. But what else was there? "Master, master, master, master!" Luna burst into the office without knocking. Volcara already had a short reprimand on her tongue, but before she could give it voice, the Padawan added breathlessly, "He's awake, and he broke his restraints." Both Jedi Masters were on their feet and headed to the door. "Get Master Yoda," Okara bid Qui-Gon in her most authoritative tone. The taller man obeyed without question. "Get me a security droid," Okara ordered her apprentice. "I'm not letting him wreck 2 wards in 1 bleeding day." The first time Ben had woken up, it had been pure panic, an unusually emotional display from what his hazy memories told him. Still, Jedi stoicism aside, he was of the opinion that panic was the only viable reaction to waking up after dying. He had died. Well, he was supposed to have died. But apparently Ben Kenobi was destined to lose his right to a proper death along with everything else. It felt poetic, in a twisted sort of way. How Vader had managed to keep him alive, Ben hadn't the slightest inclination. Perhaps it was the work of the Emperor himself. Obi-Wan had never had the pleasure of meeting Palpatine after his ascent to power, but he knew well enough that Sith Lords delved into arts so dark that even the wisest, greyest Jedi had no comprehension of their existence. Mental manipulation, he was sure, was well within the purview. His psyche had suffered for months at the hand of Asajj Ventress, and she had been a reject apprentice. He could only imagine what kind of power the Master held. But if he were dead, or close to it, he had nothing to fear from Palpatine or Vader. He thought of Luke, and something in him ached. He would die, and Luke would carry on. He had to be at peace with that. He could not let Vader succeed at whatever game he'd crafted to torment his old master. Ben rubbed his wrists, chafed red from where they'd restrained him to his bed. It was insulting, really. Anyone with a smattering of midichlorians could get themselves out of that. He glanced around the quaint hospital room and had to commend Sithis for their attention to detail. Everything, from the scratchy bed sheets to the thin shift rope to the astringent scent of disinfectant and Bacta, was just as it would have been. Vader must have lent some of his memories to their endeavor to make the experience as realistic as possible. Ben drew in a deep, centering breath to keep himself from remembering those distant days. There was no death, it seemed. He reached out with his senses and was shocked and relieved to brush with a sliver of light. There was, however, still the Force. All at once, a healer, a healer's apprentice, and a droid burst through the door. Ben gave Okara Chay's likeness a bemused expression. "Hello there," he said, sitting calmly on his bed, brushing the offensive restraints away to dangle neatly off the bed frame. This reaction seemed to confuse the healer. Good. 20 years and Obi-Wan could still keep Vader on his toes. "You're awake," the Twi'lek said. "I suppose so." Awake, dead, who was keeping score? He would play along. "You gave my apprentice quite a fright," Okara said, taking a hesitant step forward. Obi-Wan glanced down at the Nautolan girl, who was making a brave effort to hide her anxiety. Ah. Had Okara ever had a Nautolan apprentice? Obi-Wan had surely met all of her apprentices in the course of his troubled medical history. He frowned. But how had Vader remembered? And why had he seen fit to implant such a fine detail? "I'm sorry about that," he offered. Compassion was sure to do him little good here, but he'd spent too much of his life fighting wars to indulge in convenient austerity in death. Beside that, Nautolan eyes were incredibly disarming. He gave the apprentice a smile. "My apologies, young one." Nervously, the apprentice smiled back. The ripple of the light that shone across the Force felt too real, too untouched by the dark. Obi-Wan's focus faltered, a worm of doubt forging into the back of his mind. "You seem calm." Okara came over to him, inspecting the neat way he'd folded the sheets around himself, how he'd thought to rebuckle the restraints and tuck them out of the way. "Last we spoke, you were convinced that you had died." "Yes, well," Ben said, brushing his shoulder and savoring how clean his hospital robes were. "After that show on the Death Star, you might understand why I thought so." He chuckled. "But I see now that it was something of an illusion." He looked up around the room and back at Master Che. "As is this, I suppose." "I'm sorry? My senses are not so dull. I can only assume that because I am not dead, I will be very soon, after you attempt to get some information from me. What I know that you could possibly want, I haven't the slightest idea. I'm an old man. Do your worst. I haven't anything to lose anymore." It felt like a lie, but no matter. There is no emotion. There is peace. 35 Standard is hardly old, Okara said, opting to ignore most of what he had said. For a delusional maniac, this man was speaking incredibly clearly, with a logical rhetoric. Paradoxically, this alarmed him more than if he'd been rambling nonsense. 35, he laughed. You flatter me, Master Che. Yes, I'm 35, and Master Yoda is celebrating his 100th life day, I'm sure. He chuckled at his own joke. Illusion or not, it had been a while since he'd shared conversation, let alone inside jokes, with another Jedi. He was surprised when Vocara produced a mirror and handed it to him. He was even more surprised by what he saw. Force. He was 35. Or at least, he looked it. His mouth fell open, and he brought an unbelieving hand up to his hair. He had hair. Ginger, thick hair. And a full beard, too, which he ran his hand over slowly, oogling the glints of red reflected in the looking-glass. Even for Sith, this kind of manipulation was excessive. That shouldn't be possible, Obi-Wan whispered to his young reflection. Vocara was standing close by. Funny you should say that. She crossed her arms in an authoritative way that stirred old instinct in the flight-or-fight region of Obi-Wan's brain. You, my young friend, are quite the impossibility. He glared up at her. Here it was, the interrogation. He braced himself. What makes you say that, Master Che? He asked innocently, playing dumb. When you arrived here earlier today, I scanned your fingerprints, and they turned up the medical records of Obi-Wan Kenobi. Imagine that, Ben said mildly, a pleasant smile on his face as he set the mirror carefully aside. Your print scanners are functional. I will alert the council. Vocara was divided between shock and irritation. But you are not Obi-Wan Kenobi, she insisted. Am I not? He chuckled. Well, from a certain point of view, I suppose you're right. I haven't gone by that name in, a long time. He nodded. I said, a very long time. Vocara hadn't been expecting that. Thankfully, she wouldn't be the one to press the matter. She turned to greet Master Yoda and Master Jin as they appeared at the door. Ben looked up as well. The Force turned as frigid as Ben's posture. The cold sent a shockwave across the room, and all three masters faltered for a moment, Qui-Gon taking a full step back. Vocara glanced between the bedridden visitor and Qui-Gon Jinn, who was on the receiving end of a dagger-point glare. I see, Ben hissed icily, muscles bunching at his jaw. His gaze flicked over Yoda, but lingered on Qui-Gon, micro-expressions alternating between apprehension and anger. He smoothed out his sheets and trained a neutral expression on the wall behind them. I take it you've come to interrogate me. Yoda and Qui-Gon shared a look. The smaller master stepped forward. Interrogate? No. Speak with you we would. Ben ticked an eyebrow. Semantic detail. Yoda waved over a repulsor table and hopped up to stand at Obi-Wan's eye level. The wizened master squinted at the man's face, studying. At length, he decided, Look like Obi-Wan, you do. Obi-Wan lifted impassive brows. A compliment which, though accurate, is completely supererogatory. Yoda chortled in amusement. He shot a glance at Qui-Gon. Speak like Obi-Wan, you do, he said. I would appreciate it if you would get to the point, Master Yoda. He spat the name in derision. He seemed to surprise the two Jedi standing near the door. Yoda took it in stride. Doubt my motives, you do. Why? Perhaps because you are dead, Ben said in unnerving calm, and then grimaced. Well, I think you are dead. I know they are dead. He nodded his head towards Qui-Gon and Vocara. And I know that I'm supposed to be dead, if you hadn't arrived to torment me. He folded his arms very calmly at his waist, squared his shoulders, and drew up the diplomatic armor he'd forged during the Clone Wars. Now, what is it that you want from me? The truth. Ben met Yoda's gaze. About what? Your identity. Ben frowned deeply at that. Of all things that the Sith could possibly want from him, they already knew who he was. Vader had known since the moment he set foot on the ship. The worm of doubt became a slithering snake, winding about his assumptions and tightening. My name is Obi-Wan Kenobi, he said, though lately I've been called Ben. Jedi, you are. Could he have been a Jedi without the Order? All was the same in the Force. All my life. Remember how you came to be here, do you? I was killed, Ben replied easily. Yoda stepped forward and picked at Obi-Wan's neckline with the tip of his skimmer stick, exposing the livid ring around his neck. Handiwork of your murderer, this is, he speculated. Obi-Wan twisted his neck around to see and gingerly touched the scar all around. He couldn't stop the jolt of alarm that shot through him when he realized the extent of the damage. They really were putting absolutely absurd detail into this illusion. "I suppose so," he told Master Yoda, voice wavering in mild surprise. "It's in the right place." Yoda shared a glance with the masters by the door. Qui-Gon stepped forward.
"If Obi-Wan you are, remember this man, surely you do."
It sounded almost like a test. But why? There was no point. Ben grit his teeth. To torture him, perhaps. "Master," he said very quietly, dipping his head towards the taller man. Qui-Gon did not acknowledge the gesture. Instead, he folded his hands into opposite sleeves and asked, "Do you remember anything at all from earlier, after you died?" Ben could hardly look at him. Forza was just like him. From the barely tamed hair to the baritone voice to the set of his feet that reeked of maverick authority, it was all so completely Qui-Gon Jinn. Even after all these years, even contemplating it set Obi-Wan's heart fit to break. "No," he said, subconsciously folding his arms into sleeves in the mirror of his old master's stance. "I woke up here, in the halls. I made a bit of a scene, I'm afraid." He nodded apologetically at Master Che. "You were found this afternoon," the healer told him, stepping further into the center of conversation, "in one of the furthermost basement levels of the temple, half buried beneath a pile of smoking rubble." Ben was frowning. No, he didn't remember that at all. But why would such a fabrication matter to the Sith? What was the point of deceiving him? Was Vader trying to disorient him, compromise his emotions and throw him off kilter so that he'd crack?
"Distressed you are."
Master Yoda's senses were as sharp as ever. "This isn't real," Ben said, looking away suddenly. "This is an illusion, falsehood. I am dead."
"So ready to be rid of life?" Yoda accused. "Or so ready to be rid of us? What think you that we are?"
"Ghosts, illusions, lies of the Sith come to draw out scraps for the Masters." The 3 Jedi Masters stood straight at attention and indignation.
"Sith?"
Yoda's ears turned up, eyes sharp.
"Sith you think us to be?
Thwack! Obi-Wan's hand shot up reflexively. He gaped in surprise and glared. He hadn't taken a gimmer stick to the back of the head in quite a number of years. Yoda's pinched glare of authority was just as patronizing as he remembered it being.
"Foolishness, that is. Use your senses. Trust in the Force. Fear the Sith, do you?"
Obi-Wan glared harder, adamantine resilience bucking away and presenting him with decades of reasons why obedience meant certain death. He steeled himself and tentatively widened his senses, prepared to come fist to fist with the dark ambush that Vader had no doubt set for him. Light. Light all around him. His ready fists fell through a forgiving veil, and he stumbled through to a land he'd been trying to reclaim for decades. His expression slackened. The Force he was strong. Stronger and luminescent and clean, and the dark was small, infinitesimal compared to what it had been. And Yoda was Yoda, and Vokhara was here too, and Obi-Wan nearly choked on emotion when he reached out towards Qui-Gon and felt the exact, perfect, unforgeable, irreplaceable portrait of his master. "That's not—" he struggled, face blanching, lungs quivering. Vader, the Emperor, the illusions, the interrogation were all beginning to melt away, leaving him bare in a floating world that made no sense. The snake of doubt grew and pulled up its head, poised to strike. "That's not possible," he said, and then louder, because the blood rushing in his ears muffled the sound of his own voice. "That's not possible. You're dead. All of you are dead." He could feel the other Jedi, the other thousands, tens of thousands of life above and around and below him, burning with light. But they weren't there. They couldn't be there.
"Dead? I am not. Dead? You are not. Found you today, we did. Caused great disturbance in the Force your arrival did. Much confusion, much worry, yes. Upset the sick younglings, you did."
Obi-Wan's internal breakdown put itself on hold so he could frown. "Sick younglings?" What an odd thing to say. "It's bantha flu season," Vokhara offered. "There's a whole ward next door of initiates and Padawans puking up their guts as we speak." Bantha flu? But surely there had been vaccine developed for that years ago. There hadn't been a significant outbreak of bantha flu at the temple since... And surely Anakin wouldn't remember that. He couldn't have. Ever. The snake of doubt sunk its fangs into Obi-Wan's awareness. He felt the venom rushing up towards his consciousness slowly, like the beginnings of a tidal flood. This is going to sound odd, but... He rubbed at his eyes. What year is it? Frowning slightly at the question, Vocara tilted her head and told him, 25/12. Ben's hand froze on his eyes, and then he opened them to show his horror. His mind reeled through the calculations. But that's... His chest heaved, and he wondered how all the air had managed to leave the room at once. That was 42 years ago, he realized. He looked up to the others, begging for confirmation. He found none. That's not possible. He glanced again at Qui-Gon and realized that the man's hair was not quite as gray as he remembered it being, the wrinkles in his face not quite so deep. His breathing quickened again. The light cradled him with merciless silence, and he struggled to see anything in his mind's eye but Vader. Vader and the Death Star and Luke melting away in a tide of venom. The long-awaited freedom from their gaze did not feel like victory. The next time Ben bothered to look around, Vocara was by his side and telling him to breathe. He tried to obey, recalling the calming breaths Qui-Gon had taught him years and years ago. Qui-Gon, who was standing in the room with him. They weren't dead, were they? Surely death would be less confusing than this. Oh, Force, he was so tired. Breathe, come on now, slow breath, just so, the healer told him, firm hand on his bent back. As Ben struggled out of his panic, Vocara glanced back and met Qui-Gon's eyes. Unless he's a Force-damned time traveler, I don't know what else to tell you. The memory passed between them. Qui-Gon frowned and looked at Ben's distraught face. He shook his head in disbelief. Vocara thinned her lips and shrugged. More visitors, we have, Yoda observed, ever calm.
Master Windu, Padawan Kenobi, come in. Discussing the calendar, we were.
At the sound of his name, Ben looked up. His eyes moved over Mace in dull recognition and onto the shorter figure by his side, to the face of... himself. Obi-Wan Kenobi, 16 standard, wide robes, Padawan cut, in front of him. Inexplicably, Ben's hyperventilation disappeared, and he was left to openly stare. Obi-Wan stared right back. Mace had been intending to report their findings to Master Yoda straight away, but as soon as Ben and Obi-Wan's eyes met, a percussion of energy shot out across the Force and distracted him to the point of silence. It took him a minute to realize that all the others had fallen silent too. They all stared. Yoda broke the long and awkward silence.
Have something for our new friend, Padawan?
He asked, voice bubbling with absurd amusement. It took a moment for Obi-Wan to realize the question was directed at him. He glanced up at the wizened Green Master and nodded hesitantly. Qui-Gon was watching with a troubled expression. The change in his apprentice's demeanor since that afternoon was palpable, unnatural. He glanced at Ben, whose mien had undergone a similarly drastic transformation in the past few minutes. Obi-Wan took a step forward. Padawan? Qui-Gon protested quietly, hand twitching against the urge to physically hold the apprentice back. For perhaps the first time in his apprenticeship, Obi-Wan not only ignored Qui-Gon completely, but could not have paid attention if he tried. I found this, the boy was saying, unclipping something from his belt. It was a very old and very dirty lightsaber. I think it belongs to you. An awkward beat. Obi-Wan? No one said a word. Ben had a half-closed hand about the hilt when the name was spoken, but at the sound his grip faltered. His eyes bore into those of his younger self, who was, against all logic, staring back with complete tranquility in his eyes. Yes, it does, Ben said eventually, politely. Surreal was not a large enough word. Thank you, Obi-Wan. He took the saber and laid it in his lap, eyes never once leaving the apprentice's face. Obi-Wan gave a stiff, shallow bow. For the next 20 seconds, Mace Windu frowned, Vocara J quietly contemplated the medical implications of time travel, and Qui-Gon Jinn stood paralyzed by the door, struck dumb by the realization that the Force signature of his Padawan was a pure mirror of this other Obi-Wan. He had no reference point by which to classify the alarm he felt. 20 seconds ran out. Slowly, without collaboration, Mace Windu, Vocara J, and Qui-Gon Jinn all turned their eyes to Master Yoda. After a leisurely pause, the Grandmaster shuffled on his repulsor table and cleared his throat.
Speak with both of you, I will,
he declared in a deep, serious tone, but then in something bordering on mirth.
But first, rest you must, Master Kenobi. Dying, bad for health is, yes.
He perched on the edge of his table and jumped deftly to the ground.
Sleep you should. Rest in the light.
Master, Mace was beginning to say, but Yoda cut him off.
Convene with the High Council, we must.
We will meet at once. The Koran nodded firmly.
No, tomorrow.
Master? Yoda did not reply and hobbled towards Obi-Wan instead.
Walk with me, Padawan.
He waved a clawed hand to bring Obi-Wan to his side. They walked to the door, giving Master Jin a wide berth. As they left, Padawan Kenobi cast a nervous glance at his master, but Qui-Gon's eyes were riveted on Master Kenobi. For his part, Ben was staring, dazed and exhausted, at his returned lightsaber, his unwrinkled hands, his ginger fringe. He felt eyes on him and looked up. The eyes of master and former apprentice met, and both were afraid of what the other saw.
Loiter you do, Qui-Gon?
Yoda nagged from the hallway.
Have you not a stack of holobooks to return to Master Nu?
Qui-Gon left the room without a word. Alone now with a shock-ridden Jedi, Vokhara reverted to a detached bedside manner, administering a new IV and rubbing Bacta over the livid side Shah scar in silence. At length, she had to say, "Since I don't have your full medical history, I'll need you to fill out any major details, Obi-Wan?" "Ben," he broke in, I haven't been Obi-Wan in a long time." Looking at him, she wondered how old he had been when he earned that scar. His eyes made him look like he could have been 100. Through the sadness, he gave her the kindest of smiles. "Just call me Ben."